So, Dan, you received a credit I've never seen before. I'm pretty sure it says Chaplin choreography created by. I think is the credit. I've never heard of that. How I got involved was I had been interviewing a gentleman by the name of Paul Jacobs, who as a child had been a star at Keystone beginning in 1913. This was in the late 80s, up through about 1990 and 91. I was interviewing him in a series of interviews, and some of that was published in a magazine called Shadowland. And Richard Attenborough got wind of this. And David Robinson gave him a copy of the interview, and he said, I have to meet this man, because in 1991, he was the last person alive who had worked at Keystone when Charlie Chaplin arrived at the studio. And so he said, how do I get a hold of him? And David Robinson said, well, I think through Sam Gill's the way to do it. So he called me and said, Mr. Attenborough, Sir Richard, would very much like to meet Paul Jacobs. And I said, there's only one problem, and that is that he swore me to secrecy, that I would never give out where he lived or his name that he was using to live by at that time. Because when he retired at age 8 in 1918, he never looked back, which sounds familiar, I'm sure, to many of you who know Baby Peggy's story, is that it was many years before she could even talk about having been Baby Peggy. It was very similar for him because he had actually had his career he was working with very major stars. So I called him and explained the situation that Richard Attenborough was making a documentary on Charlie Chaplin called Chaplin, or Charlie at the time, I think it was. And he'd very much like to meet you. And he goes, but Sam, you know, I don't talk about this other than to you. And I said, well, do you think you might make an exception? And he said, well, I don't know, where do we go? And I said, Fillmore. He goes, where the hell is Fillmore? Because it's like, 50 miles away from L.A. And I said, well, I don't know either, but I'll find out, and I'll take you there. And he says, on one condition. And I said, okay. He says, at any point from when you pick me up to when we arrive at the filming location, if I don't want to go through with it, you have to take me home immediately. And you can't stop and go talk to him. You have to take me home. I said, well, I guess that's okay. So I explained the situation to David Robinson, and he said, well, come on out. We'll see how it goes. Well, as it turned out, it was a mind-blowing experience for him because as a 3-year-old, he said he had only fuzzy memories of the studio, of what it looked like. Well, due to Marc's work, the Keystone studio was recreated in Fillmore to look exactly the way it did in 1914 and late 13, early 14 when Chaplin came. So later, he tells me, you know, I'll never forget this because all of a sudden my fuzzy memories became sharp. I always thought that was fascinating. Now, the scene they were shooting, Richard Attenborough, they were busy shooting the scene, which you'll see in the movie, where it's a scene from The Immigrant, and Edna Purviance is having to do take after take after take, eating a bowl of beans. The problem with that was that Chaplin wanted her to look famished. Well, after 46 takes, she wasn't too hungry anymore. And the scene we saw that was being filmed, which is one of my favorite scenes, she says, Charlie, if I have to eat one more bean, I'm going to be sick. And he turns and he explains why he wants her to look hungry, walks away, and he says, more beans. And she throws some at him. So anyway, it turned out to be a wonderful thing because once there was a little bit of a lull, Richard Attenborough came over and was incredibly gracious. He had that ability when he talked to you that you're the only person that he's focused on. But he did it with 4 of us. How do you do that, And I remember David was there, David Totheroh and his father Jack. And But anyway, that's that story. The only other thing I'm going to mention just briefly is that I had a chance to meet Raleigh Totheroh himself in 1966. I think he passed away the next year. So it's just lucky that I said, well, I've got to go to Hollywood. I don't care. I was 19 years old, and I told my parents, I'm not staying in this town in Kansas another summer. Goodbye. And so I went to Hollywood, and one of the people I met at the Motion Picture Country House was Raleigh Totheroh. And there was something he told me that's in the movie. So I'm not sure whether Marc told him or David or how Attenborough found out about this. But it's the scene where Chaplin's film is being edited, but they're editing the negative, and they screen the negative. And what's more, when he turns to Mac Sennett and says, how much do you want of Mabel? And he says, oh, the usual. And he goes like this to his nose, like that. That's real. Raleigh Totheroh told me that is the way that they were cutting films. They were projecting the negative. And he said it was Charlie Chaplin at SNA here in Niles that said, no more. You cannot edit and project my films. So he was the one that, what was that?
My negatives.
Yeah, the negative. That was unheard of. You don't screen a negative because it has to be pure. You know, you make your answer print and then you look at your answer print. So Chaplin said, who had been at Keystone, he said, no, you can't do that anymore. And the person who was given credit, according to Raleigh, who was the editor, was not Raleigh himself, but Tom Kreiser, who later went on and was Harold Lloyd's major editor. So those are my stories, and anything more.
Okay, I think it's appropriate that I was the last up here because I am clearly the outlier. All of these people got their association with this job through their personal talents and experiences. My only connection was sort of the serendipity of genetics. So there was nothing about me other than the fact that I had a grandfather who was involved that got me to that film. And again, serendipity, it just so happens that 1990 was the 100th anniversary of my grandfather's birth. And as a result of that, I had decided that it would be fun for my family's Christmas present that year to put together a compilation of as many of my grandfather's films as I could find. Now, of course, the Chaplins, most of them were available, but I started doing work on some of the Bronco Billies and seeing what else I could find that he had worked on. So that was the beginning of my sort of serious research. And it just so happened that that was the same time that Attenborough was developing his project and getting things going. So I had a friend who was a mutual friend of Dan's who called me up at one point and said, they're shooting out in the orange groves outside of Fillmore. You need to go. And having grown up, another serendipity, having grown up maybe 10 miles away from where all this shooting took place, I hopped in my car and went on up and basically just sort of insinuated myself in the shoot. Had the good fortune, again, because of Sir Richard's personality, to be sort of accepted as the mascot of the film. So I was there for virtually the entire U.S. shooting. They did shoot some footage in England and in Switzerland, but for virtually all of the production work in the U.S., I was there as basically a mascot until it was David Tomlin, the first assistant director, came over to me one day and said, you know, you're just sitting around here the whole damn time. Go over to costuming and get yourself into a costume. So I was in a couple of scenes early on, and then they decided that it would be good for me to be Raleigh's assistant. And so for a couple more scenes, I got to play my grandfather's assistant. So here I am in the process of researching my grandfather's career, doing it in the context of a major motion picture like he worked on, talking to a cinematographer who had been an idol of mine in college, because the cinematographer on the Attenborough film was Sven Nykvist, who shot all of the Ingmar Bergman films and comes very close to being the only other person with the same longevity that Raleigh had with Chaplin. They worked together over 38 years. As far as I know, that is a record in the history of the film industry of cinematographer and director working together. And Sven Nykvist and Bergman worked together for about 25 years, although Nykvist worked on other films as well. What you should look for if you're looking for me, it goes by quickly, but there are a couple of scenes very early that I almost don't even recognize myself in. But when they open the Chaplin studios, when Chaplin finally builds and opens his own personal studio, it is now the studio that still is on La Brea Avenue, just south of Sunset, and now the home of the Jim Henson Company, or the Henson Company that produced the Muppets. Anyhow, when they reproduced this opening, this celebratory opening of the studio, Attenborough was so gracious to have many of the families of the people who were actually involved, including my own family. My father is on a movie camera, on a newsreel camera that is, quote, recording the action of that scene. I have a still camera standing right next to him, and a little bit earlier in that scene, you will see my niece. So there were 3 generations of Totherohs in this scene, holding a little brownie, and she was basically sort of playing the part of a secretary at the studio. Takes a picture of Chaplin as he walks by and has a line that says, "Thank you, Mr. Chaplin." And so that's the scene to find me. And I also, if you look very carefully, I believe it's the scene where they're looking at rushes of city lights in the screening room. And you will notice that I turn and nod very knowingly at one point that, yes, this is the right scene. And in one of the scenes that Dan helped choreograph, Marissa Tomei, who played Mabel Normand in the film, happened to be involved in either makeup or costuming, I'm not sure which, and was not there. And so you will not see, because clearly it was a rehearsal, that I also played the part of Marissa Tomei's stand-in the film.
Okay, 2 real quick last things that you'll love to hear. And that is, there's a scene in which there's a close-up of Chaplin's mother, and that actually was played by Geraldine Chaplin. Played the hand. No, it was Betty Chaplin, Chaplin's cousin, were the hands. Right. And of course, Geraldine plays the mother in the film. And one last thing, and that, believe it or not, Lita Gray Chaplin, I don't know if you can see her, but we premiered, for City Lights, it was premiered at the Los Angeles Theater in downtown LA in 1931. And so we used that actual location. I got that location for Attenborough, because I deal with LA Conservancy and all the theaters in downtown Los Angeles. So get this, she was brought to the theater, and she's in the scenes when everyone's coming in to the premiere scene, and everyone is in the lobby ready to take this big shot, and then Attenborough quiets everyone down. There must have been 100 people. Were you there that night? Yeah. So if you remember, he quiets everybody down, and he calls looking for me. Marc, where are you? And I'm hiding behind a column. And what did I do? And all he did was this. He went like this. Like, he was so excited to film at the Los Angeles Theater.
Are you done?
Yeah. No, that's it.
Marc reminded me of something else, that a matter of personal privilege that I will take. When Geraldine showed up to play her own grandmother, I was lucky enough to have gone through some of my grandfather's personal collection, and I found 2 still photographs that he had taken and was able to present those to her. And it was a delight to give her pictures that my grandfather had taken one of her with her mother and one of her with her father at her first birthday party.
You see, he plays down his role in all this. It is damn important that the Totherohs are a part of this whole film. I think we're done, right?